I'd like to talk about two kinds of conditioning this afternoon: classical, or Pavlovian conditioning, and operant, or Skinnerian conditioning. Both are kinds of learning, in that they involve a relatively permanent change in behavior. And both of them are named for the scientist most associated with this type of conditioning: Ivan Pavlov, in the case of classical conditioning, and B.F. Skinner, in the case of operant conditioning. These two types of conditioning require associating behavior with environmental stimuli. And of course, stimuli are things that cause a response. Starting with classical conditioning, most of you have heard of Pavlov's dogs, and you know that in his experiments, Pavlov sounded a tone right before a dog was fed. He eventually managed to provoke the dog's natural reaction to being fed, the salivating behavior, with the tone. That is, the dog would salivate, really, its mouth would water, at nothing more than the sound of the tone. Let me review Pavlov's whole procedure with you. To use the correct terminology, he first just used an unconditioned stimulus, the food, or I think Pavlov used meat powder. This unconditioned stimulus naturally produced the unconditioned and automatic response, the salivation. Then, he paired the conditioned stimulus, the tone, with the unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder. After some repetition, the dog salivated at the sound of the tone in the absence of the food. The salivation in this case was the conditioned response. It's important to note that this was not a conscious thing. This response was an unconscious change in behavior in response to a conditioned stimulus. Now, operant conditioning can also be beyond conscious thought, but it can also be more consciously learned. That is, the subject may actually think consciously about its behavior. In operant conditioning, again, this is also called Skinnerian conditioning after B.F. Skinner. Well, in operant conditioning, the subject, often a rat or pigeon in experiments, but this also works with humans quite well, the subject learns to associate its actions with certain outcomes and changes its behavior based on whether these outcomes are pleasant or unpleasant. That is, whether the results are perceived as reward or punishment. Okay then, the typical experimental model for operant conditioning is called the Skinner box. It works like this. You put your rat in the box, and when it hits a lever, it gets a reward, say, a food pellet. It learns to associate this action, hitting the lever, with the results, food. And when it wants food, it hits the lever. The Skinner box can also function as a way of giving out punishments. In this case, when the subject performs a certain action, it produces an electric shock. The subject learns to associate whatever that action is with unpleasant consequences, and its behavior changes to reflect this knowledge. Operant conditioning also can involve the idea of negative punishment and reward. This is where you remove an unpleasant stimulus if a subject performs a certain action, or remove a positive stimulus as a response to an action from the subject. It's easy to imagine examples of these types of conditioning in our daily lives. Let's say you have a job with a horrible boss who yells at someone every day as soon as he or she gets to the office. Let's say that it also happens that the boss comes in just after 9 every day, and that at 9 o'clock you hear a bell in a clock tower outside your office ring at that time. You would almost certainly feel yourself tensing up and feeling uncomfortable at the sound of that clock bell every day. And this would probably continue to happen even if your boss took a week off. It would be a conditioned response. Classical conditioning. An operant conditioning example would be if you began to make the connection, consciously or not, that handing things in early made your boss act friendly toward you, or keeping your desk clean made you safe from his or her verbal attacks. Until you decided that you'd had enough of your boss, you would learn to modify what you did to get the response you wanted from your difficult boss. In the cases of both types of conditioning, there are certain variables that greatly affect the rate of learning and the depth, the strength and permanence of the behavior modification. One factor is the time between the different stimuli. In the Pavlovian model, for example, if the tone is heard a long time before the food is delivered, it will take a long time for the dog to make the connection. If the punishment or reward is long after the target behavior, the subject will take much longer to change its behavior and may not make any connection at all if the time delay is long enough. Okay, I realize that this was a very quick overview, so before I go on to anything more complicated, I should ask if there are any questions so far. Please don't be shy because that really was fast. The point is to get through the basics quickly, so we can move on to a more detailed discussion. But if I'm losing you, then now is the time to ask for clarification.